In the spring of 1863, when a new housing project was approved on the crumbling remains of what used to be St. Joseph's Home for Girls, no one in Belhaven expected anything more than a quiet demolition. The old stone building, blackened by time and ivy, had stood abandoned for over 40 years. Locals whispered about it, of course, about the smell that never left the air, even long after the nuns were gone. But no one truly believed in the stories. Not until they started digging the courtyard. On the second day of excavation, laborers struck something hard under the earth. They thought it might be stone part of the original foundation. But what they uncovered was far worse. A long, shallow pit. Inside it were the bones of 27 girls. Some were curled up, others stretched unnaturally. Some still wore the remnants of white uniforms with the faded insignia of St. Joseph's Home stitched at the collar. Their small skulls, many fractured, some still bearing the thin braids of brown and red hair, stared back with hollow silence. The site was shut down by dusk. Police surrounded the area, and within days, men from the diocesan office arrived in black coats, speaking to no one, eyes scanning the town like it owed them something. The newspapers printed a brief column, human. Remains found at former girl's home. Investigation ongoing. That was all. No names, no outrage. No follow-up until Eleanor Whitgrave read it. Eleanor was 29, living alone in a small apartment above her bookshop on Rose Street. A woman of quiet habits and a deep love for forgotten history. She had no family left except for a few distant cousins she barely remembered. But she knew the name St. Joseph's Home. Her grandmother, Nora Whitgrave, had once whispered about it on stormy nights. They buried her there. She'd said once, her voice barely a breath, her little sister Marnie, she was just 13. And no one asked how. Eleanor had only been 10 when she heard it. Back then, it sounded like one of those strange tales old women told to scare children. But now, it rang in her ears like a warning bell. The next morning, Eleanor went to the local records office. She didn't tell anyone why. She just asked, calmly, politely, for any historical files on St. Joseph's Home for Girls. The young man at the front desk looked uneasy. "It's restricted," he said, adjusting his collar. "Church property, sealed after the ... after the closure." "When did it close?" 1897. "Fire damage," he muttered. "That's all I can tell you." But that wasn't all. 3 hours later, Eleanor stood inside the Belhaven Library's special collections room, a dusty corner no one ever used, flipping through old microfilm newspaper reels. She found a headline from November 12, 1897. "Fire at St. Joseph's Orphan Home. Entire north wing destroyed. No casualties reported. Lies." She kept digging. An article from 2 days later mentioned an inspection quietly conducted by church officials. No public explanation. Just one strange quote from a witness. It wasn't the fire that scared them. It was what they found after. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her bookshop, the lamps casting soft yellow shadows over the wooden floor. Rain tapped gently on the windows. She stared at an old photograph she dug out of her family trunk, her grandmother as a young girl, holding the hand of a pale child in a white dress. Marnie, was she one of them? One of the 27? The thought wouldn't leave her, and something inside her, something older than memory, told her she had to know, even if the town wanted it forgotten, even if the church sealed every page, even if the bones were meant to stay buried. Eleanor barely slept that night. The image of her Marnie, That pale little girl in the white dress haunted every corner of her mind. She dreamt of the courtyard, not as it was now, but as it must have looked in the late 1800s, wet cobblestones, rusted gates, the faint sound of laughter that turned into screams the closer she got. She woke up before dawn, heart pounding. By 7 in the morning, she stood outside. The rusting iron fence that still surrounded the remains of St. Joseph's home. The demolition had been paused indefinitely. A guard sat in a small booth by the front, reading a newspaper, clearly bored and uninterested. Eleanor nodded politely and walked round the perimeter instead. The courtyard was on the east side now, covered in plastic tarps and yellow. Caution. Tape. But in the early sunlight, she could see the edge of the excavation site, a jagged hole in the ground, a gaping mouth that once swallowed innocence. She didn't need to get closer. She felt it. The past had been disturbed, and now it was awake, back at her shop. Eleanor pulled out her grandmother's old letters and documents, stored in a wooden box under the floorboards. She hadn't touched them in years. Most of them were mundane, recipes, bills, family gossip, but one letter, folded carefully inside a torn envelope with no stamp, caught her attention. It was addressed to Sister Agatha and dated March 3rd, 1891. Eleanor unfolded it slowly. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. Sister, the girl you brought from Millport, her name is Margaret Ellis. I fear she's not suitable for the white program. She asks questions. She fights the sleep tonic. She remembered her last session. I suggest moving her to Block C before she infects the others. If she speaks to the choir girls, we could lose everything. There was no signature. Eleanor stared at the page, her hands trembling. White program, Block C, sleep tonic. This wasn't just a place for orphans. Something had happened here. Something structured, organized, and deliberate. Whatever program they were running, it wasn't about education or charity. And Margaret Ellis was, she one of the 27, or something worse. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited Belhaven Church, the oldest in town, and the one that used to sponsor St. Joseph's home. The priest there, Father Benedict, was an older man, kind-eyed and soft-spoken. She approached him during confession. Hours, not to confess, but to ask. Double quotes, Father, do you know anything about St. Joseph's home? The ... old girl's home? His expression froze, if only for a second. That place was closed before my time, he said gently. A tragedy, fires, and ... well, the past. Do you know about the 27 bodies they found? His eyes flicked up to hers, cold now. That's not church matter anymore. It's under civil investigation, but it used to be church property. And some things, he said, lowering his voice, are buried for good reason. That was all he said. She wasn't even asked to leave. He just turned away, slowly, and walked back into the church's rear chamber. That night, Eleanor opened the letter again. She wrote Margaret Ellis in her notebook and began cross-checking every census record, school registry, and death certificate she could find. She didn't find Margaret, but she found a funeral record buried in the city's death roll, lover Jane Doe, age estimated 14, cause unknown. No family, buried on site by order of diocesan board. It was dated March 8th, 1891, 5 days after the letter. Suddenly, Eleanor didn't feel like she was chasing a story anymore. She felt like she had just entered one. The cold set in early that year. By mid-April, Belhaven felt more like February grey skies, sharp winds, and that constant dampness that made the town feel older than it already was. Eleanor sat alone in her bookshop, the doors closed to customers, curtains drawn. In front of her was a growing wall of notes, newspaper clippings, census logs, orphan admission records, and every detail she could find about St. Joseph's Home, and yet, the more she found, the less sense it made. There were too many missing. Names, whole years where no students were recorded. Letters signed with initials, not names. And every record tied to the nuns who ran the home ended in one word. Transferred. Transferred where? Dead ends everywhere. But one name kept coming back, like a weed that refused to be pulled. Sister Agatha. Eleanor circled it in red. She wasn't listed on any official church rosters. She didn't show up in any obituary or burial registry, and yet letters mentioned her constantly, requests for supplies, behavior reports, discipline notices, always with the same tone, fearful respect, almost like she wasn't a nun at all, but something more dangerous. That night, Eleanor visited the town's oldest graveyard, St. Bartholomew's, where the original caretakers of St. Joseph's were supposed to be buried. She carried a small lantern, walking between leaning stones and crooked iron crosses. It didn't take her long to find the section she was looking for. Sisters of Mercy to 1882, 1897, 23 graves in total. All with the same style of marker, name, date, a short phrase, usually something like "called home to God." But one marker was different. It was a flat stone, sunk deep into the earth. The name had been chiseled out. Only the dates remained. 1854, 1897, no epitaph, no initials, no cross. Eleanor knelt down beside it, tracing the rough stone with her fingers. It had been defaced and aged. Someone had intentionally erased this name. A sudden gust of wind swept through the graveyard, rattling the trees. Eleanor's lantern flickered violently, and for a second everything went dark. Then she heard it, a whisper, low, breathy, like someone exhaling words straight into her ear. She never left. Eleanor froze. She spun around. No one was there, just shadows and wind, but it hadn't been her imagination. That whisper hadn't come from her mind. It was real. It was near. She stood, heart pounding, and backed away from the grave. Her lantern flared back to life, its light spilling across the cracked path leading out. She walked fast, then faster. She didn't look back until she reached the gates. And even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following just out of view. Back home, Eleanor scribbled in her notebook with shaking hands. There's a grave with no name. 1854 to 1897. It has to be her. Sister Agatha. She's not gone. Someone or something didn't want her remembered, but she's still here. Watching. That night, the dreams came harder. She saw a long corridor of stone, lit by torches, rows of beds, all empty, a girl with her back turned, hair braided tight, humming something Eleanor couldn't understand, and then sharp movement, a scream, not loud, but cut off halfway, like a breath pulled from the lungs. When Eleanor woke, she was drenched in sweat, her bedsheets twisted around her like rope. One word echoed in her mind, Block C. By morning, Eleanor couldn't tell if she was more exhausted from the dream, or from trying to forget it. She sat with her tea untouched, staring at the words she had written in her notebook sometime around 3 a.m., half asleep and shaking. Block C, no light, no noise, no return. She didn't remember writing it, But the pen was still in her hand when she woke up. The words were hers, and they felt true. St. Joseph's Home had never advertised separate blocks. It was supposed to be a single building, modest, humble, religious in nature. One chapel, one dormitory, one classroom. But then why did so many of the letters mention Block C? Eleanor returned to the archives. This time, she wasn't polite. She went straight to the back, where old building plans were stored on dusty rolls. No one had touched in decades. After 2 hours of digging, she found it. A blueprint of St. Joseph's. Dated 1878. She unrolled it across the library. Table. Her heart dropped. The building wasn't small. It had 4 wings. The north and south wings were labeled dormitories. The west was marked kitchen and staff quarters, but the east wing Block C was unmarked. No rooms listed. No designations. Just a thick, black line, like it had been drawn over with heavy ink, like someone had tried to erase it from the plans without physically removing it. At the very bottom, in tiny print, was a single note. Access via sub-basement tunnel. Not for student use. Eleanor stared at that phrase for a long time. Sub-basement. There was more to St. Joseph's than even the townspeople suspected. She copied the layout and returned to the ruins before sunset. The construction site was deserted. Now, yellow caution tape fluttered in the wind. The courtyard was still exposed. The earth beneath it disturbed and cracked. She walked slowly around the perimeter again, using the blueprint as a guide. If the sub-basement existed, it would have been beneath the east wing, which meant it had to be just beyond the courtyard. Sure enough, near the back corner of the site, half covered in dirt and debris, was an old metal hatch. The kind used to access coal cellars in the 1800s. Its handle was rusted, the hinges fused, but the shape was clear. A way in. Eleanor's heart pounded. She didn't have tools to open it, not yet, but she had confirmation. The sub-basement existed. Block C was real, and no one was talking about it. She was about to head back when she noticed something else beside the hatch. Embedded in the ground was a broken plaque. Half the letters were worn away, but a few remained, immemorial for the innocent. Dedi, 1902. Someone had placed a memorial here, and someone had destroyed it. Eleanor stood in the wind, the chill sinking into her bones. Who would bury 27 girls, and then try to erase not just their names, but the place they were buried? What had happened in Block C, and why did her body feel like it already knew that night? Eleanor didn't dream. She heard breathing. Not hers, not from inside, but just outside her. Bedroom door. The sound of breathing outside her door lingered in Eleanor's ears long after the silence returned. She hadn't moved. Couldn't she lay frozen under her blanket, every muscle in her body tight, her breath caught in her chest? It had lasted maybe 30 seconds slow, measured breathing. Not hurried, not panicked, just waiting, listening. When she finally forced herself to sit up and turn on the lamp, the hallway was empty. The door still locked from the inside. Nothing disturbed, but she didn't sleep. Again, by morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She couldn't rely on blueprints and whispers anymore. She needed to see Block C with her own eyes. She returned to the construction site at midday, this time with a crowbar and a flashlight hidden inside her bag. The guard had gone. Funding for the project had been pulled. The town had, it seemed, lost interest. Eleanor didn't blame them. No one wanted to remember. That was how things stayed buried. The hatch was still there, She knelt beside it, brushing away the last of the dirt, and wedged the crowbar into the rusted hinge. It took all her strength. The metal groaned, then cracked. One hinge gave, then the other. The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, cold. Damp air rushed out to greet her. Eleanor clicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through thick dust and cobwebs. She took a deep breath and stepped down into the earth. The stone steps were slick, the walls damp with years of condensation. The smell hit her halfway down, stale air, mold, and something else, something faintly metallic. Like blood at the bottom, she reached a small landing. Then a hallway. The walls were bare stone, carved rather than built. A narrow pipe ran along the ceiling, dripping slowly in places. There were doors on either side, thick wooden ones, each with a small, barred window at the top. She passed the first one and peeked inside, an empty room. A mattress on the floor, a wooden chair facing the wall, nothing else. The next one was the same. The third had a small table in the corner. On it, a broken teacup and something else, a torn piece of fabric, white, laced, embroidered with red thread. She picked it up carefully, a collar. Stitched inside were the initials, M.E., Margaret Ellis. Eleanor backed out of the room, her chest tight. The fourth door wouldn't open, rusted shut. The fifth was different. The door stood slightly ajar. The inside was pitch black. She stepped in slowly, her flashlight catching the edge of a mirror. It was a wide chamber, bigger than the others. Stone floor, high ceiling, and at the far end a row of wooden benches. A chapel down here. Eleanor scanned the walls. Behind the altar, faint paintings remained, worn images of saints, but with their faces scratched out. The room felt colder than the others. She moved toward the front end, then froze. On the wall beside the altar, someone had written in charcoal, faint, but still readable. They watched. We screamed. No one came. Eleanor felt like the air had been punched out of her lungs. She turned to leave, and that's when she heard it. A small voice, soft, childlike. "Are you one of them?" Eleanor spun around, but the chapel was empty. She stood there, heart pounding, flashlight shaking in her hand. Then the voice came again, this time from the doorway. "They always come alone." Eleanor's flashlight swept frantically across the stone walls and shadowed pews, but the voice, soft and clear, had come from nowhere, or everywhere. She whispered, "Who's there?" But her voice cracked halfway, brittle and weak. Silence, the kind of silence that crushes air out of the lungs. Then, footsteps, small, bare, coming from just behind the doorway. Eleanor backed toward the center of the chapel, her light still aimed. At the entrance, a shape moved, low, quick, just a flicker, like a child ducking behind a bench. A pale leg, a braid. "Please," she called out. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want to know what happened." No answer, but the footsteps resumed, closer this time, slow and steady. Then they stopped. Just behind the last bench, Eleanor stepped forward cautiously, aiming the flashlight down. The space was empty, but the floor, it was covered in chalk drawings, dozens of them, stick figures, all in rows. Small girls in white dresses. One large figure with sharp teeth, another with wings. In the corner of the chapel, near the broken altar, someone had drawn a sun, but it had a face crying beside it, scribbled in shaky, childlike handwriting. They took our voices. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. Whatever. had happened here wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional. These weren't just graves in the courtyard. These were buried screams. She turned quickly and left the chapel room, her boots echoing sharply in the narrow hallway. But the moment she reached the stairwell, she stopped. There, on the final step leading up to the hatch, was a footprint, small, wet, bare, fresh. She hadn't come down alone, heart pounding. She climbed the steps, 2 at a time, forced open the hatch, and stumbled into the cold, grey daylight. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths as she slammed the metal door shut behind her and dropped the lock into place as she backed away. Her eyes fell once again on the broken memorial plaque, "Mil novecentos e dois," she whispered. They tried to honor them. Someone tried, but someone else erased it. Someone who still didn't want them remembered. She went home in silence, her skin ice cold and her hands trembling even hours later. That night, she sat at her desk, staring at the collar she'd found. Margaret Ellis. She placed it in a glass box and set it next to her grandmother's old photo. Then, out of instinct, she opened the back of the frame. A piece of yellowed paper fell out. She unfolded it. A list, 27 names, every one of them handwritten and circled in red ink near the bottom. Marnie Whitgrave, 13, choir group, last seen March 5, 1891, her great-aunt buried there. Somewhere under that cursed earth, tears filled Eleanor's eyes, not just grief, but rage. The church knew. The town knew. Someone in power let this happen. She looked at the names again. A date was written next to each. Most were between 1890 and 1897. All those missing years from the records, all those quiet funerals with no families. Suddenly, the air in the room changed, heavy, cold. And behind her, she heard the soft sound of a song, a hymn, a little girl's voice, humming from the hallway. The hymn was slow, soft, a melody that sounded both innocent and heartbreaking, like something sung to babies in a nursery, or whispered. In a coffin, Eleanor didn't move at first. She sat at her desk, eyes locked on the hallway outside her study, the humming growing louder with each passing breath, not rushed, not threatening, just there, a sound that didn't belong in this world. Anymore, she stood, quietly, her heart thudding in her chest like a warning drum. Slowly, she stepped toward the hallway, the floor creaking under her weight. The sound stopped. Silence. Eleanor turned the corner and found nothing but shadows and the ticking of her grandfather's old wall clock. No one. But something was different. The air smelled of candle wax and damp linen, and written on the mirror near a coat rack in the faint outline of a child's fingertip were 3 words, "We remember you." Her breath caught. She didn't scream. Instead, she reached for her notebook and wrote it down. Every moment, every sound, every scent. She didn't trust memory anymore, not with ghosts whispering in her ear. She knew what she had to do. The town had forgotten, the church had erased, but the girls... they remembered. The next morning, Eleanor returned to the public records office, this time looking not for building plans or death certificates, but for court cases. If 27 girls died at a church-run home, someone must have tried to hold them accountable. She dug through archives for hours. Most files were missing, refiled, or lost. But in the back corner, buried under a stack of unrelated documents, she found a slim file marked Estate of Josephine Agatha Langdon, Dispute over Death Certificate, 1903. Her hands trembled. as she opened it. Inside, a single letter from a lawyer, addressed to the Belhaven Council. My client, Mr. Edward Langdon, seeks clarification on the circumstances of his sister's death at St. Joseph's Home. No death certificate has been issued, yet the sisters claim she was buried in consecrated ground. Mr. Langdon has been denied access to the premises. He suspects, rightfully, that foul play occurred. I request formal inquiry. There was no follow-up, just a note scrawled in pencil. Denied. Subject mentally unwell. No further investigation. Eleanor slammed the folder shut. They didn't just bury the girls. They buried the people who loved them too. That evening, she drove out to the east edge of town where the Langdon family had once owned farmland. It was now just overgrown woods and rusted gates. She found the remains of a fence and an old sign broken in half. Langdon Orchard. A single tree still stood tall near the edge of the field, dead now, bark peeling like dry skin. Beneath it, Eleanor found a stone. Worn smooth, the name Josephine was barely visible, and beside it, someone had carved into the wood of the tree. She knew the truth. They took her tongue before they took her life. Eleanor sank to her knees. This wasn't just one crime, it was a network, a system. Powerful people had silenced anyone who dared ask questions. Families labeled as unstable, whispers ignored, grief discredited. But she would not be silenced. That night, she gathered her findings into one file. 20-7 names, one erased wing, none who never left, and a truth that could burn the last shreds of Belhaven's reputation to the ground. But before she could act, there was a knock at her door. 3 slow, deliberate taps, and a voice on the other side. Miss Whitgrave, we need to speak with you about what you've been digging up. Eleanor didn't move. She stood motionless in the center of her living, room eyes fixed on the front door. The voice on the other side was male, calm, polite, but too calm, too polite, like someone used to hiding malice behind good manners. She said nothing. Another knock, firmer this time. We know you found the ledger, the voice continued. We'd like to make sure it doesn't confuse you. Ledger, her blood ran cold. She hadn't found any ledger yet, but now she knew there was one dot. Proof. She backed away slowly, her hand inching toward the drawer where she kept her grandfather's old revolver. Not loaded, not even functional, but it made her feel less helpless. The voice continued, You're not in danger, as long as you understand this was all very long ago. There's no need to stir the past. Then silence. She waited, held tight until the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long across the floor. When she finally opened the door, no one was there, just a folded envelope left on the welcome mat. Inside was a photograph, a black and white image of a young girl, older than 12, her hair tied in 2 braids, standing beside a woman in a dark habit. Both were smiling. Written in neat script on the back, Margaret Ellis, Sister Agatha, 1890, Choir Garden, Block C. Eleanor sat down slowly. The voice knew she had found something, but not everything. That meant she had time. She stayed up all night, reading every note, every scrap of paper. She needed that ledger. If it existed, it would be underground. In Block C, maybe even in that chapel she had fled too quickly. At dawn, she packed a backpack with water, gloves, her flashlight, and a small hammer. This time, she brought a camera to Dot as she crossed the field toward St. Joseph's again, A crow flew overhead, its call sharp and sudden. Like a warning, she reached the hatch and descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The hallway was silent, the same rooms, the same smell. The chapel door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the air was colder than before, as if the walls were holding their breath. She walked slowly to the front, toward the altar, her flashlight scanning every crevice. Behind the pulpit, there was a panel slightly raised from the stone. She crouched, pried it gently with her hammer. It gave way. Beneath it lay a wooden box, wrapped in a decayed cloth and bound with a strip of rusted iron. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were 3 leather-bound ledgers, pages, yellowed with age, each one marked with a single phrase. Wards of St. Joseph's private notes. Initiation records. She flipped through the first one. Each page listed a name, age, date of arrival, then disposition, compliance, level, use, category. It read like inventory, not of children, of property. She found Marnie Whitgrave's name. Beside it, age, 13, per choir voice, strong physical health, excellent status, prepped, ready for transfer. Resistance, minimal tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. She had been selected, groomed, shipped off like cargo, page after page. Confirmed her worst fears. The home hadn't just abused children, had sold them, quietly, systematically, to priests, politicians, doctors, men with influence and money, and the church had kept the records. As she turned the final page of the second ledger, she found something else, a letter, addressed to Sister Agatha. Keep the ledgers hidden. If the fire doesn't work, we'll claim madness. Let Langdon scream. She has no allies. As for the Whitgrave girl, mark her as terminal. No one is coming. Eleanor dropped the book. A presence, cold breath against the nape of her neck. A whisper, not angry, not hateful, just sad. We told you. They always come alone. Eleanor turned, fast flashlight beam cutting through the darkness behind her, but again, no one, just the chapel. Still watching, she steadied her breath, picked up the ledgers, and slid them carefully into her backpack. Her fingers shook as she touched the last one, thicker than the others. This one had a title pressed into its cracked leather cover in gold. Ink. White register, initiates. Approved. She knew, before opening it, that this was the final list. The chosen ones, inside. Every name was catalogued under categories. Choir, group medical study, private client requests, each with a destination code. Some had addresses, others only initials. These weren't just orphans. These were victims of a secret supply chain. And the worst part, some destination codes matched. Government facilities, hospitals, laboratories, even asylums. This wasn't just a religious institution. It was a pipeline, and the church wasn't the only one involved. At the very back of the ledger, someone had scrawled a note in red ink. 27 accounted for, 3 failed conditioning, 2 sent back, 1 missing. Eleanor circled it. Could someone have escaped? She dug through her notes, flipping through everything she'd gathered. Then she saw an old article from 1933, tiny, buried in the obituaries. Miss Marion E. Langdon, 55, dies peacefully in New Hampshire. Retired schoolteacher, survived by her husband and 2 daughters. Former resident of Belhaven Orphan Girls' Home, though she rarely spoke of it. M.E. Marion Ellis Langdon. She'd survived. She'd escaped, changed her name, started a life. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had to find her family. She climbed out of Block C, back into the daylight, and immediately drove toward the county records office in the next town over. There, she traced Marion's lineage, found a marriage certificate, found a daughter, still alive, living 2 towns over, under the name Catherine Yarrow, age 72. Without hesitation, Eleanor got back in her car and drove through the fading light. She reached a small white house nestled among trees. Wind chimes clinked gently in the breeze. A wooden cross hung by the porch. Eleanor knocked. After a long pause, a woman answered, short, grey-haired, sharp blue eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Eleanor stepped forward. "Are you Catherine Yarrow, daughter of Marion Langdon?" The woman's face changed. Not shock, not anger, resignation. "I always knew someone would come, eventually," she said quietly. "You look like her." Eleanor blinked. "Look like who?" "My mother's friend," she said. "The one she said was left behind. The one they never found." Catherine opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I think it's time you knew what they did and what she made me promise to finish." The house smelled like tea and old wood. Catherine led Eleanor into a small living room filled with books, photographs, and quiet. Sunlight. On the mantel above the fireplace was a black and white portrait of a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, in a school uniform, not St. Joseph's, but something simpler. Her hair was in 2 braids. Her smile was almost defiant. "She said her name used to be Margaret," Catherine said, nodding to the photo. "But when she left that place, she made herself a new name, Marion." Eleanor sat down, barely breathing. "She told me things when I was young. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know the world wasn't as kind as it pretends to be." Catherine poured 2 cups of tea and sat opposite her. "She said there was a wing in that place they never showed. Visitors, where girls disappeared after dark." She remembered the chapel, the chanting, the tea that made her head spin, the cold hands. She was there, Eleanor whispered. She was one of the 27. Catherine shook her head slowly. She said she was supposed to be number 28. Eleanor's stomach turned. She escaped. She pretended to drink the tonic, Catherine explained. Pretended to comply. Pretended to forget. But every night she counted who was left. And one night, when there were only 3 of them, she slipped out, took a nun's cloak and walked straight out the front gate just before dawn. She didn't look back. But the others, ... She said one girl was already too far gone. The other, she thought, was still fighting. She left the cloak for her. Eleanor swallowed hard. That must have been ... Marnie. Catherine nodded. She said the second girl never made it out. She saw smoke coming from the east wing a week later in the distance. She always thought it was a cover-up. It was, Eleanor said, her voice tight. They burned the records, erased names, buried the bodies. I found the ledgers. Everything. It's all still down there. Catherine leaned forward. My mother made me promise when the truth finally surfaced, I would help finish what she started. Eleanor frowned, which was, expose them, not just the nuns, the buyers, the politicians, the families who paid for silence. She said if even 1 page survived, it was enough to tear it all down. Eleanor pulled the ledgers from her bag and placed them on the table. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She made copies of her own, she said softly, hid them in the wall behind her bed. They're still here, but you have the originals. Eleanor nodded slowly. Will anyone believe us? No, Catherine said, but they'll fear us. Eleanor looked down at the final ledger still unopened, the one with private client requests. She hesitated. Catherine said, if you're going to finish this, you have to know every name, even if it ruins you. Eleanor opened the ledger. One by one, names stared back, some crossed out, others circled in red. She recognized at least two. One was the current mayor of Belhaven's grandfather, the other, Father Benedict, the same man who told her, some things are buried for a reason. Her hands shook as she closed the book. I'm going to publish this. You'll have to move fast, Catherine said, because once they know you have it, they won't come knocking politely anymore. Outside, the wind howled, and in the distance, the bells of St. Bartholomew's began to ring, though it was far from Sunday. The bells echoed long after they stopped ringing. Eleanor stared out the window, her thoughts churning faster than her heartbeat. She'd always known the truth would be ugly. But this, a chain of abuse spanning decades, a ledger of innocent lives bought and traded, and the names, so many of them, still in power. She looked back at Catherine, who seemed calm, not unbothered, but prepared. How long have you been waiting for this? Eleanor asked. Since I was 16, Catherine replied. Since my mother let me read her diary. She wanted me to grow up before I saw how the world really works. Eleanor nodded slowly. I think I'm ready. Catherine leaned forward. Then let me show you something. She led Eleanor into the back room, an old guest bedroom with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards. Catherine reached behind the headboard, pried loose a wooden panel, and pulled out a wrapped bundle. Inside were 4 notebooks, aged and worn. My mother's testimony, Catherine said. Names, events, descriptions, even a map of Block C. Drawn from memory. Eleanor flipped through one of them. Margaret Marion had been meticulous. She'd named Sister Agatha, Father Aldwin, even a doctor who wasn't supposed to be there. But what struck Eleanor most was a page titled Day. Watched. It listed 10 names, each one a man, each marked confirmed client. Politicians, Catherine said quietly. Businessmen, some still alive, some whose families are still in charge. They all paid to keep that place running. Eleanor looked at the page again. Her eyes stopped at one name. Judge Thomas Halloway, the man who dismissed the Langdon family's request for investigation in 1903, declared the brother mentally unstable. That one stroke of his pen had killed the case before it began. How do we do this? Eleanor asked. We can't just publish it on Facebook. Catherine gave a half smile. No, but we can leak it. Journalists, archivists, survivor networks. You spread enough of it through the right channels, people will have to look. And once the noise starts, it doesn't stop. Eleanor took a deep breath. She scanned a few more pages. There were details only someone inside the program could have known: ritual schedules, drug dosages, punishment methods. Her stomach twisted with every word. But the girls had recorded it all. They had found a way to be heard. Decades after they were silenced. Let's scan everything, Eleanor said. Then upload and back up to multiple drives. We'll get it in the hands of people who can't be bought. And the ledgers? Catherine asked. Eleanor held one of them close. I'm keeping one, in case they come for me. That night, they worked in silence, scanner humming, notebooks opened, screens lighting up the darkness. Outside, rain began to fall, and somewhere in that storm, Eleanor heard it, again, the soft hum of a child's voice, that same mournful hymn. But this time, It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like hope. Like someone was finally listening. The first email went out just before dawn. Catherine clicked send and leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen. A copy of the ledgers, scans of Marion's notebooks. The list of names, every piece of evidence, had been bundled into encrypted files and sent to a network of journalists, historians, legal advocates, and survivor forums. They didn't expect all of them to care. They just needed one. Within an hour, the replies started. Is this real? Where did this come from? I've heard whispers about St. Joseph's before. I'm in. By noon, a blogger with a small but dedicated true crime following published a post titled The Forgotten Girls of Belhaven, What the Church Tried to Bury. It spread faster than either of them expected. By sunset, #StJoseph27 was trending in several states, and by midnight, the silence broke. The Diocese of Belhaven released a brief, sterile statement. We are aware of certain historical claims circulating online. These appear to be fabrications or misinterpretations of archived material. The Church condemns all forms of abuse and encourages victims to come forward through proper channels. Catherine laughed bitterly. Proper channels, you mean? The ones that buried this for 100 years. But Eleanor didn't laugh. She sat quietly, reading a message from a reporter at a major news outlet. We want to verify these documents. If they're real, this is explosive. We need an interview. You or the source. Eleanor knew what that meant. It had to be her. Catherine had a family, a quiet life. Eleanor had nothing left to lose. Her bookshop had already been vandalized once since the first post went live. She agreed. 2 days later, she met the reporter, Emily Tran, a determined woman with a skeptical eye and a voice recorder always on. They sat in a coffee shop outside Belhaven, Eleanor watching the windows constantly. Why now? Emily asked. Why dig up something so old? Because the bones were never the story, Eleanor said. The cover-up was, and it's not over. Their names are still on buildings. Their descendants are still in office. The silence is still loud. Emily nodded slowly. Did you see them? She asked. Eleanor hesitated. I heard them, she whispered. I think I still do. The article dropped the next morning. The St. Joseph Ledger, how a small town buried a mass grave and built its legacy on silence. It went viral in under an hour. The mayor held an emergency press conference calling for a full historical inquiry. Church officials went dark, but the town Belhaven began to remember. Old women came forward with stories. Men whispered about their grandfathers. One former janitor even called in to a radio station, saying, they always told me not to go near the East Wing. I thought it was just superstition, but I heard the screams once, long time ago. Didn't sleep right since. That night, Eleanor received a letter slipped under her door. No stamp, no envelope, just a folded piece of yellow paper. It read, you were warned, stop or be silenced. Like the rest. No signature, no mistake. They were scared, and that meant she was winning. But she wasn't foolish enough to think she was safe. Because the deeper you dig into old graves, the more likely you are to wake something that never wanted to be found. Eleanor stared at the letter, her fingers tightening around its edges. Not out of fear. She had moved past that. This was confirmation. They were watching her now, actively, boldly. The same people who had buried the girls were still pulling strings. From the shadows, the descendants of those who profited from pain, the ones whose families owned law firms, hospitals, and banks. But Eleanor had something they didn't, proof that refused to stay quiet. Still, she couldn't ignore the warning. She slept that night with a kitchen knife on the table beside her, bed and her phone recording audio until sunrise. Nothing came, but the message had been delivered. The following day, she received an email from a former priest, anonymous, who claimed he had once served in the archives of the Belhaven diocese. His subject line read, "I saw the ledgers before they disappeared." The email was short. There was a fourth book, one they never talk about, a client list, not buyer sponsors, funders. I saw it once in 1974, names that shocked me. I think it was locked in the stone altar of the subchapel. Beneath Block C, no one ever dared go there. If it still exists, it will end them. Eleanor's chest went cold. She had thought the 3 ledgers were the end of it. But there was one more, the sponsor ledger. She contacted Catherine immediately. Catherine didn't hesitate. "I'll come with you," she said. "We go back tonight." At midnight, they returned to St. Joseph's for what they both knew might be the last time. The wind was bitter, the hatch heavier than before. The air, in Block C, staler, like it knew what they were after. They passed the familiar corridor, the tiny rooms, the chalk drawings. When they entered the chapel, something was different. The temperature dropped immediately. The air felt denser. Time seemed to slow. Eleanor walked to the altar. The stone top was cracked slightly, something she hadn't noticed before. She brushed away the dust and saw a tiny keyhole embedded into the side. "I don't have a key," she whispered, "but—" Catherine stepped forward, pulled a small iron key from her coat pocket. "My mother gave it to me the day she died," she said softly, "told me to guard it. I didn't know what it was for, until now." She slid it into the lock. It turned. With a loud creak, the top of the altar opened like a vault door. Inside was a metal box, sealed tight. They pried it open. There, wrapped in waxed cloth, was the 4th ledger. The cover was embossed with a gold seal that read, "Sponsorship Registry, St. Joseph's Outreach Program." Inside, names, dozens, each one accompanied by an amount: $5,000, $12,000, $40,000, dates, purpose, status, active, on hold, deceased. And on the very first page, written in perfect calligraphy, "We bless those who provide. Through them, we serve the greater cleansing." Eleanor's breath caught as she scanned the names. 3 state governors, 2 cardinals, and the founder of the most powerful law firm in Massachusetts. "I need to get this out," she said. But before she could say another word, her flashlight flickered and then died. Catherine's light snapped off to dot in the pitch black. A whisper echoed through the chamber. Not angry, not pleading, just final. "Now you know." Eleanor froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. That whisper didn't come from a hallway or a corner. It came from everywhere, as if the stone itself had spoken, as if the walls had been waiting for this moment. Her hand groped in the dark, searching for Catherine's arm. "Don't move," she whispered. "Don't run." Catherine's voice was steady, low. "I'm here." They stood side by side in the complete dark, surrounded by old air, ancient memory, and something that was listening. Then a soft glow lit the far side of the chapel, a faint blue shimmer hovering near the altar. Not fire, not a flashlight. Something else. Figures began to appear, no detail, just outlines. girls in white gowns, braids, bare feet. They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, staring at Eleanor. 20-7 of them. No eyes, no owls, but the pain hung in the air like incense. Thick, bitter, heavy. Eleanor clutched the fourth ledger to her chest. "I know what they did to you," she whispered. "I have the proof." One of the ghostly figures stepped forward, small, fragile, her braid unraveled, her dress torn. She reached out a hand not to threaten, but to offer. Eleanor understood. She knelt and placed the ledger on the altar. As her hand left the cover, the glow brightened. The figures lifted their heads, not to scream, not to speak, but to look skyward, as if they finally saw the door opening. One by one, they began to vanish, dissolving into light. All but one, the smallest girl. She stayed. She stepped closer. Eleanor whispered, "Marnie." The figure nodded. A warmth filled Eleanor's chest, something that felt like a sob trying to be joy. She reached out, but her hand passed through the ghost-like mist. Marnie raised her face. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Instead, she placed her fingers to Eleanor's heart, then pointed to the exit. A final message: keep going. She faded into the air. The lights returned. The chill lifted. The chapel was still again. Catherine slowly turned her flashlight back on. "Did that happen?" she asked, her voice shaking. Eleanor looked down at the altar. The ledger was gone. All that remained was a single phrase, carved into the stone where the ledger had sat. "Truth is not revenge. It is release." They climbed back out into the early morning light, silent, changed. The story had begun with buried bones, but now it was no longer just about memory or justice. It was about setting the lost free by noon. Eleanor released the last wave of files to journalists, activists, and international watch groups. Not just the names, but photographs, donations, letters. It exploded like wildfire. The media could no longer ignore it. Neither could the law. Subpoenas were issued. Retired bishops were questioned. Families of missing girls demanded exhumations. Some of the accused disappeared overnight. Others went on television with fake tears and weak denials. But the reckoning had begun, back in Belhaven. The field where St. Joseph's once stood was fenced off permanently. The town council approved a new projector memorial park at its center, a monument carved from the same stone that had once made up the chapel. 20-7 names, and one inscription: "They sang for salvation. They died in silence. They will never be forgotten." 1 year later, Belhaven was not the same town. The bookshop on Rose Street reopened its windows, no longer dusty, but filled with fresh flowers and copies of the published expos, the 27, a true account of the forgotten girls of St. Joseph's. Eleanor Whitgrave didn't just become a name in history. She became a guardian of it. She had told the world about Marnie, Margaret, and the others. She had cracked open the silence that had sealed the lives of so many girls beneath the earth. But even with the lawsuits, the documentaries, the investigations, Eleanor knew this wasn't the end. History didn't disappear. It just waited. Catherine had moved closer to town. Her grandchildren played in the new memorial park, unaware of the agony buried in its soil. And that was the point. They didn't have to carry it. The weight had finally been lifted. The park had become a place of quiet. School groups visited. Candles were lit every 12th of November, the day the bodies were found. And every year, a new bouquet would appear at the base of the monument with a single card: for the one who was almost 28. You were the voice they couldn't steal. Eleanor never found out who left it, but she always smiled when she saw it. One morning, nearly 2 years after the story broke, Eleanor visited the graveyard behind St. Bartholomew's. The nameless grave sister, Agathis, had been removed. In its place now stood a small plaque, unknown, never absolved, never forgiven. Some truths didn't deserve memorials. As she turned to leave, she heard a voice behind her. A young girl's voice, Miss Whitgrave. Eleanor turned and saw a girl about 12, holding a notebook. My teacher told us you're the one who found the girls. I'm doing my paper on them. Eleanor smiled gently. That's a heavy story for a school project. The girl nodded. I think stories like that should be heavy. Otherwise, people forget how wrong it was. Eleanor knelt and handed her a small pressed flower from her pocket white lily for innocence. Then tell it right, she said. Tell it so no one forgets again. That night, Eleanor dreamed for the first time in months. The chapel, the stone walls, the soft hum of a hymn. But this time, the room was filled with light, and 27 girls stood beside her, no longer faceless, no longer broken. They sang not for help, not for escape, but for peace. And as they faded into the light once more, Marnie smiled. This time, Eleanor smiled back.